Hello, BookTube, and welcome to February Fantasy Stories. This is week 3. Again, I'm quite late with this, but first week we did classic fantasy that was chosen. This is all chosen by the Bookish Bryants, or created by the Bookish Bryants, and classic fantasy was anything pre 1971. And the second week was Sword and Sorcery, a la Conan, that type of thing. And third week is Dark Fantasy. And for Dark Fantasy, I chose to read some stories from this Mike Ashley edited volume called Doorway to Dilemma, Bewildering Tales of Dark Fantasy. It's a collection published by the British Library, and it's a series of books that they're doing called Tales of the Weird, which I think is a very apt title. But and this one was put together and published in 2019. If those of you who have been watching my series know that I like Mike Ashley for his science fiction, and especially his science fiction history of the science fiction magazine. But he's sort of an expert, and he's very knowledgeable on the popular literature and magazines, Victorian and 20th century. Includes science fiction and fantasy and other types of popular consumed, culture fiction. And in each of these volumes, he has a little bit of an introduction, and this one is about a four-page introduction, but it's quite interesting because I have never been, I've said this in each of the videos, I've never been a huge devotee of fantasy, because I always just blanketed fantasy with stuff like, these multi-volume, like heroic or high fantasy tales that, there's 1,500 pages and there's 553 and a half books written by and just bloated books. And I have not read Lord of the Rings, and it is something that I do want to read because that's on a different bit of a level, and I cater to some of the older stuff and that's what I think of fantasy mostly is newer stuff, and newer as I'm talking not post 71, but post basically Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. That's what I class as newer. But anyway, Mike Ashley has an interesting introduction here. As I say, it's called "What is Dark Fantasy," and I'll read a few bits from it. And he starts out as, quote, "Fantasy, in its broadest sense, covers the entire field of weird and supernatural fiction. Fantasy is about the impossible, at least in our understanding of the natural world. It includes magic, monsters, ghosts, anything and everything that seems to defy the laws of science." Then he goes on and talks about J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Robert E. Howard's stories, and saying the high fantasy and so forth, and all their offshoots. Then he says here another quote: "There is another genre fiction labeled horror. It's not a very helpful label, because it describes a mood of fiction, not its contents. Any fiction can contain scenes of horror, especially crime fiction, and does not need to be related to supernatural fiction or fantasy, but horror has tended to become attached to stories of zombies, vampires, and the like, with the catch-all term of supernatural horror." That's what I consider as supernatural horror. So he a lot of times speaks my mind, and he's got a lot more experience reading this stuff. But to me, something can be horrific, but to me, it has to be for horror. Real horror is supernatural horror. Anyway, and then he goes on to say, "You'd think that covered all forms of fantasy, but it doesn't. There are those stories which deal with the inexplicable, the strange, the unsettling, and just plain bizarre. They don't include ghosts or vampires or sorcerers, or dragons. They tend to be set in our world, often the here and now, but where the characters experience things they cannot explain and which become unnerving and frightening. In the past, these have been classified as horror or strange tales or weird fiction, but they now revel in the term dark fantasy. So that was quite interesting for me. And then he goes on to, because, as I say, because I struggle with sometimes terms, because, well, I think everybody does. They get it. They read stuff and they get in their own mind what that term sort of means, and sometimes it becomes a popular way, but that's not what, where it came from and where it's sort of going, or what people who are like Mike Ashley, who are like you could say historians of the genres, and they are mostly more well read. They're extremely well read in these areas, more than most fans are, I would say. With the exception of many, but even people who just read fantasy all the time, unless they read it 24/7, 10 or 12 hours a day, and they've been doing that for 30, 40, 50 years, then they would not match up to people like Mike Ashley, I don't think. Anyway, he sorry for the interpolations, but then he goes on to say the coinage of the term is usually attributed to the author Charles L. Grant, where he regarded it as referring to events affecting individuals which are beyond their understanding. But the term itself had been around for decades. It was used by the Illustrated London News to describe a picture by Sidney H. Syme, The Floating Island, in its special Christmas issue in 1931. Syme, or Sim, S-I-M-E, is a good example of an artist whose images were often dark reflections of the fantastic, particularly when he illustrated the work of Lord Dunsany. And basically he talks about Lord Dunsany being the poster boy, in other words, of dark fantasy. And there is a Lord Dunsany story in here, but I didn't get to it. And I do like Lord Dunsany. I've read Lord Dunsany before. So, and he just goes on, talking about other stories in general in here and how they fit in. Now, I read 5. First 4 are quite short, and I'll just sort of quickly go through them, and then we'll go them in backwards order. First story is What Was It? By Fitzjames O'Brien. And then The Anticipator by Morley Roberts. Then 2 stories by Frank R. Stockton, The Lady or the Tiger, and The Discourager of Hesitancy. And then the 5th story was the longer story, The White People by Arthur Mackin. Now, as I say, we'll go backwards because then because we did the front, the first to the last. We're going from good to bad for me. So we'll start out with the bad. And Arthur Mackin, who is a huge writer. He lived, very, very popular and very influential. And I'd known this, and I was very excited, and I wanted to read this story because I had read Arthur Mackin in the past, and I didn't really remember too much about him. And I was quite sure I didn't read The White People before. But let's just get into it a little bit here. And like Arthur Mackin lived from 1863 to 1947, and he's got a little introduction about the characters here. About the authors. Along with Bram Stoker, M.R. James, and Algernon Blackwood, Arthur Mackin is one of the major writers of supernatural fiction at the end of the 19th century. And saying he developed an interest in mysticism and local folklore as a child. And he grew up in Wales. He went to London in 1880, and he wanted to take up medical studies. But he he just continued reading esoterica, and by 1881 he published a poem, and then he decided to give up law studies and work as a journalist, and then started writing. Other stories by him is The Great God Pan, The Inmost Light, The Shining Pyramid, and The White People Here, and many others. Now, as I said, I thought I had not read this before, but as I was getting into it, the story, it's about 45 pages long in this version, I realized I had read it. And it sort of all came flooding back of what I thought of the author. But we'll get to that in a second. It's an interesting story. It's a very bookish story in a sense. It starts out with somebody discussing, like a conversation in somebody's home library, or their home collection. And the character borrows a book, and called The Green Book. And it's a manuscript sort of telling about these white people that the author that is writing down had seen. And the text for the whole story basically is this, and talking about him and looking at this manuscript and what is written. So it's very bookish in some ways. Like, it's a very bookish, in when he mentions, M.R. James at the beginning there, it made me think of him because it's sort of like an antiquarian type person. Like the characters were that are that were in discussion, and the guy who's investigating this book. Because there's talk about how the book was, that it was, it's not bruised, like there's no dings on it and stuff like that. It's in good shape, but it's just been neglected for a long time, and it's faded a little bit. But what tedious writing! And I remembered that extremely tedious writing. Like, this was, like I say, about 45, 46 pages long. And I found it interminably long, like extremely long. Like, in the last couple weeks, or the last like 3 or 4 weeks, I read some long books. Like, I read over 1,000 pages, Gargantua Pantagruel by Francois Rabelais, and did not find that long, And I read Dahlgren, which was over 800 pages by Samuel R. Delany, and that was written in a weird way. But I did not find it long. I found it kind of interesting to read. And Gargantua Pantagruel is one of my all-time favorite books anyway, so that's fine. And I'm not 100% sure of my opinion of, Dahlgren as whether it's a good book or not. It's interesting, and that's a different discussion. But my point is that 800 to 1,000 pages, to me, isn't long. But 45 of this story was a lifetime of reading. I found I couldn't even read it in one sitting anymore. Like, it's almost like it was back to when I first had, when I was first trying to read with the COVID. Well, I still had actually COVID, not just the long COVID. I'd read a little bit, and it's just, I'm stumbling over it. It's just like, it just to me seems like badly written. It's just the choice of words, the sentence structure was awkward. But anyway, I don't want to get into it because I know there's huge fans of Arthur Mackin, and I've read this, and I know I've read other stuff, but off the top of my head, I can't think of what they were. And I was kind of excited to see that in there, and that's why I put this off, and I wanted to read this story today. Because I wanted to revisit him. And I would say I've had enough of Mackin for now. I think maybe in another decade or two or something like that, I might revisit him. I'm not sure if I have, because the Oxford World Classics put out a larger hardcover, I think, called the God of Pan. What's it called? The Great God Pan. I'm not sure whether I got that or not. If I do, it's probably never going to be picked up for a long time. Anyway, I think you get the gist that I did not care for it. Then we go back to the two previous stories by Frank R. Stockton, The Lady or the Tiger, and The Discourager of Hesitancy. They're related stories. I see this as sort of a poor man's sort of fairy tale, a fairy tale type kingdom where there's a king who has the ultimate, like, big punishments and court cases. There is a special way to get at the person's guilt or innocence, whether it is or not. But it is that's why it's called the lady or the tiger, or the tiger or the lady, where the accused person gets a choice in an arena. There's two doors, and he gets to open one door. One of those doors, a woman will come out, and it'll be something sort of a woman of his dreams, in a sense, that he gets to marry, and he's innocent. He goes off and lives a happy life, sort of. And then the other one is a tiger that leaps out and kills him and eats him. So this young guy's crime basically is to have fallen in love and to the king's daughter. So he's put on trial here. So, if he gets killed, then obviously he can't do anything, but, he'd prefer to live. But would he prefer to live without the king's daughter because he has to marry this other woman? So it's got this sort of, double-edged sword of, damned if you do and damned if you don't, almost. But the daughter he thinks has found out, she has found out which door is the tiger and which is the woman. And she signals to him which one is which door to open, but he it's left. You don't get a solution at the end, whether, like the author says, what do you think happened? Was it the tiger or the woman? Because, the character starts thinking this as well, like, whether would it be better to this, or which is she telling him to open where the tiger is to make sure he gets the tiger, so he's gone, so he's not, she can mourn him and get over and all this kind of thing, and or the woman, because then it'd be still sort of a longing on both sides. So we don't know, but anyway, and then I can't too much remember the second one, to be honest. But anyway, it's like I thought it was a poor man's fairy tale, but it was okay. Like, it wasn't great. And then the one prior to that by Morley. Frank R. Stockton. Let's just look at him a little bit here. It says he was one of America's most popular humorists. He carved for himself a niche using fairy tales and fables as a way of satirizing society and pricking the bubble of pomposity. And sort of late 1800s and early 1900s. He lived from 1834 to 1902. And then the next one is The Anticipator, which by Morley Roberts, who lived from 1857 to 1942. See, these could be, classical fantasy as well, but they happen to be termed as dark fantasy. And it's like in his youth, Morley Roberts did not seem he would make much of his life. So he went to Australia, was a sheep farmer for a while, and came back. And he befriended George Gissing, who advised him, to write about his experiences, because he traveled around the Pacific and South Africa. And so he started writing, and he was quite prolific. And I have read a number of things by him. This one I don't think I had. And it's another bookish sort of type thing. It's about a writer, and that another writer, every time he writes something that he it's a bit ambiguous as well. I won't give away because it is a bit of a reveal, but there's another writer that every time he goes to write, or he wants to write something, there's another writer that sort of pipped him at the post, basically. So yeah, it was good. It was an enjoyable one because I do at times like ambiguous stories. And then the first one was What Was It? By Fitzjames O'Brien, 1826 to 1862. So almost pretty well a contemporary of Edgar Allan Poe in many ways writing. Um, I really enjoyed this story. It reminded me of M.R. James, but without the antiquarian aspect about it. And it's a group of people that are they're lodgers in this house, but they like the owner that buys a new house and they all move in. Hears about a house that's haunted, and so they all they want to do this, and they start talking about ghosts and things like that. And there's the main character and the and a friend doctor will take opium basically, or their drugs, and then talk about subjects. And this one night it's about evil, of what evil is. And so he goes to bed, thinking of this kind of thing, and all of a sudden something drops on his chest and grabs him by the throat, and he can feel this body, a small body. It's almost like a child's body, very strong, and he wrestles it off, you know, and he's holding it down, and he gets the light on. He lights the lamp. He doesn't see anything on his bed, but he can feel the body, and his hand is above the blankets. It's freaking him out, but he's made enough noise that the others in the house, hear him, and they come in, and his doctor friend comes in, and and think he's a bit doolally, or the drugs has got to him. But he tells him to come over and feel. So he feels, and he feels the body on the bed, a small body. And it's humanoid, but, the facial features seem a little different. So they get some cord and they tie this creature up. And, and and it doesn't talk, but it's clearly there, but they can't see it, and it's freaking them out. And the other people sort of move out, or a lot of them move out. They just can't handle it. And then, they keep it tied up, and eventually it stops moving because they figure it is starved to death. They get another medical doctor in, and, sort of examines it and just can't figure anything out about it. But it dies apparently of starvation, and they bury it in the backyard, and that's I think that's basically where the sort of the story ends, you know. But they made in the meantime they made a cast, like a plaster cast of its body, which is Doctor, gave it to Dr. X, and it's all sort of that kind of thing of where real names sometimes aren't used. And he wanted to put all this information down. So that I thoroughly enjoyed, and that's the kind of stuff that I like. And you see, to me, I always thought that of that as supernatural horror, and it is actually, I guess, now considered dark fantasy. Which again, I'm learning something about this, even though. But I do like the title. It says "Tales of the Weird," and that fits better. They're weird tales. So yeah, so that's my third week of fantasy, February fantasy stories. Now tomorrow I'm going to be reading the readings for fourth week, and I know that these I enjoy a lot, because I've read them before. Is William Hope Hodgson's Carnacki stories, and this is the casebook of Carnacki, the Ghost Finder. I've already showed this many times. It's very short. There's 9 short stories, but I will read all these because I know that they're revisiting fabulous ones. And then now I want to, I'm sure when I finish reading this, I'm going to want to continue on with reading. There's a few others. There's Algernon Blackwood had, was it John Spencer, I think, and then um, uh, a series of stories of similar, supernatural investigators, and Sax Rohmer had as well a a series of stories, and I can't remember. Maybe that was John Spencer, but I can't remember the name of his character. But yeah, so that'll be for, and as I say, I should be able to get the video out for Monday, so just in time, just in time for the end of February. So I've so far enjoyed this. It has reopened my eyes to things. Um, like the first one because I just read continuously from the classic um, science fiction collected by edited by Jeff and Anne and Jeff Vandermeer, and it was good, but again, fairy tales and a horror story. Like I skipped ahead because I knew I wanted to read something that was good, and that was a Edgar Allan Poe story that I knew, the case of Michel Valdemar. And again, with this one, like I say, there was one really good story, the Fitzjames O'Brien. Then I do know I've read stuff before, and again, I never read, well, other than the White People, I never read any of these stories before, but I have read these authors, or at least I don't remember reading these stories, which I might have. But as I say, the gem for me out of the 5 stories I read was what was it? By Fitzjames O'Brien. So yeah, so there you go, BookTube, and I'll see if I can put everybody's the other co-hosts list down below, and yeah, and I'll be back on Monday with the final week of February fantasy stories. Take care, BookTube.